Hello, hello friends. Today we'll be continuing our Peter Pan. I hope you like it.
"And yet," said Smee, his first mate, "I have often heard you say that Hook was worth a score of hands for combing the hair and other homely uses." "Aye," the captain answered. "If I was a mother, I would pray to have my children born with this instead of that." And he cast a look of pride upon his iron hand, and one of scorn upon the other.
"Peter flung my arm," he said, wincing, "to a crocodile that had been passing by."
"I have often," said Smee, "noticed your strange dread of crocodiles." "Not of crocodiles," Hook corrected him, "but of that one crocodile." He lowered his voice. "It liked my arm so much, Smee, that it has followed me ever since, from sea to sea and from land to land, licking its lips for the rest of me."
"In a way," said Smee, "it's sort of a compliment."
"I want no such compliments," Hook barked petulantly. "I want Peter Pan, who first gave the brute its taste for me." He sat down on a large mushroom, and now there was a quiver in his voice. "Smee," he said huskily, "that crocodile would have had me before this, but by a lucky chance it swallowed a clock, which goes tick, tick inside it, and so before it can reach me, I hear the tick and bolt."
He laughed, but in a hollow way.
"Some day," said Smee, "the clock will run down, and then he'll get you." Hook wetted his dry lips. "Aye," he said, "that's the fear that haunts me." One of the first things Peter did when the group had settled in with the Lost Boys was to measure Wendy and John and Michael for hollow trees. This was a very important part of their home under the ground, for it really was the only way in and out. Once you fitted, you drew in your breath at the top, and down you went at exactly the right speed, while to ascend you drew in and let out alternately, and so wriggled up. Of course, when you have mastered the action, you are able to do these things without thinking of them, and nothing can be more graceful. After a few days' practice, they could go up and down as gaily as buckets in a well. And how ardently they grew to love their home under the ground, especially Wendy. It consisted of one large room, as all houses should do, with a floor in which you could dig for worms if you wanted to go fishing. And in this floor grew stout mushrooms of a charming colour, which were used as stools. A never tree tried hard to grow in the centre of the room, but every morning they sawed the trunk through level with the floor.
By tea time, it was always about 2 feet high, and then they put a door on top of it, the whole thus becoming a table. As soon as they cleared away, they sawed off the trunk again, and thus there was more room to play.
There was an enormous fireplace, which was in almost any part of the room where you cared to light it. And across this, Wendy stretched strings made of fibre, from which she suspended her washing. The bed was tilted against the wall by day and let down at 6:30, when it filled nearly half the room, and all the boys slept in it, lying like sardines in a tin. There was a strict rule against turning around until one gave the signal, when all turned at once. It was rough and simple, and not unlike what baby bears would have made of an underground house in the same circumstances. But there was one recess in the wall, no larger than a birdcage, which was the private apartment of Tinker Bell. I suppose it was all especially entrancing to Wendy, because those rampageous boys of hers gave her so much to do. Really, there were whole weeks when, except perhaps with a stocking in the evening, she was never above ground. The cooking, I can tell you, kept her nose to the pot, and even if there was nothing in it, even if there was no pot, she had to keep watching that it came a-boil just the same. Wendy's favourite time for sewing and darning was after they had all gone to bed. Then, as she expressed it, she had a breathing time for herself, and she occupied it in making new things for them and putting double pieces on the knees, for they were almost frightfully hard on their knees. Peter often went out alone, and when he came back, you were never absolutely certain whether he had had an adventure or not. He might have forgotten it so completely that he said nothing about it, and then when you went out you found the body, and on the other hand, he might say a great deal about it, and yet you could not find the body. Sometimes he came home with his head bandaged, and then Wendy cooed over him and bathed it in lukewarm water while he told a dazzling tale. But she was never quite sure, you know. There were, however, many adventures which she knew to be true because she was in them herself. And there were still more that were at least partly true, for the other boys were in them and said they were wholly true. To describe them all would require a book as large as an English-Latin, Latin-English dictionary. And the most we can do is to give one as a specimen of an average hour on the island. The difficulty is which one to choose. Should we take the brush with the Redskins at Slightly Gulch? It was a cheerful affair, and especially interesting as showing one of Peter's peculiarities, which was that in the middle of a fight he would suddenly change sides. At the Gulch, when victory was still in the balance, sometimes leaning this way and sometimes that, he called out, "I'm Redskin today. What are you, Tootles?" And Tootles answered, "Redskin. What are you, Nibs?" And Nibs said, "Redskin. What are you, Twin?"
So on. And they were all Redskins, and of course have ended the fight had not the real Redskins, by Peter's methods, agreed to be lost boys and so at it they all went again, more fiercely. Or we could tell of the cake the pirates cooked, so that the boys might eat it and perish, and how they placed it in one cunning spot after another, but always Wendy snatched it from the hands of her children.
So that in time it lost its succulence and became as hard as a stone and was used as a missile, and Hook fell over it in the dark. Or suppose we tell of the birds that were Peter's friends, particularly of the never bird that built in a tree overhanging the lagoon, and how the nest fell into the water, and still the bird sat on her eggs, and Peter gave orders that she was not to be disturbed. That is a pretty story, and the end shows how grateful a bird can be. But if we tell it, we must also tell the whole adventure of the lagoon, which would of course be telling two adventures rather than just one. A shorter adventure, and quite as exciting, was Tinker Bell's attempt, with the help of some street fairies, to have the sleeping Wendy conveyed on a great floating leaf to the mainland. Fortunately, the leaf gave way and Wendy woke, thinking it was bath time, and swam back. Or again, we might choose Peter's defiance of the lions when he drew a circle around him on the ground with an arrow and dared them to cross it. And though he waited for hours, with the other boys and Wendy looking on breathlessly from trees, not one of them dared to accept his challenge. The days were filled with adventures and tales, and as time wore on, Wendy feared John and Michael all but forgot they had ever lived anywhere but Neverland. And at the end of one long adventurous day, they all got into bed for a Wendy story. The story they loved best. The story Peter hated.
Usually when she began to tell this story, he left the room or put his hands over his ears, and possibly, if he had done either of those things this time, they might all still be on the island.
But tonight he remained on his stool, and we shall see what happened. "Listen then," said Wendy, settling down to her story with Michael at her feet and 7 boys in the bed. "There once was a gentleman." "I'd rather he'd been a lady," Curly said. "I wish he'd been a white rat," said Nibs. "Little less noise there," Peter called out, determined that he should have fair play, however beastly a story it might be in his opinion. "The gentleman's name," Wendy continued, "was Mr. Darling, and her name was Mrs. Darling." "I knew them," said John to annoy the others. "I think I knew them," said Michael rather doubtfully.
They were married, you know, and had 3 children and a faithful nurse called Nana. But Mr. Darling was angry with her and chained her up in the yard. And so all the children flew away.
"It's an awfully good story," said Nibs. They flew away, Wendy continued, to the Neverland, where the lost children are. I just thought they did, Curly broke in excitedly. I don't know how it is, but I just thought they did. Oh, Wendy, cried Toodles. Was one of the lost children called Toodles? Yes, he was. I'm in a story. Hurrah, I'm in a story, Nibs. Shh. Now I want you to consider the feelings of the unhappy parents with all their children flown away. Oh, they all moaned, though they were not really considering the feelings of the unhappy parents one jot. Think of the empty beds. Oh, it's awfully sad, the first twin said cheerfully. I don't see how it can have a happy ending, said the second twin. Do you, Nibs? I'm frightfully anxious. If you knew how great is a mother's love, Wendy told them triumphantly, you would have no fear. She had now come to the part that Peter hated. I do like a mother's love, said Toodles, hitting Nibs with a pillow. Do you like a mother's love, Nibs? I do just, said Nibs, hitting back. You see, Wendy said complacently, our heroine knew that the mother would always leave the window open for her children to fly back by, so they stayed away for years and had a lovely time. Did they ever go back? Let us now, said Wendy, bracing herself up for her finest effort, take a peep into the future. And they all gave themselves the twist that makes peeps into the future easier. Years have rolled by, and who is this elegant lady of uncertain age alighting at London Station? Oh, Wendy, who is she? Cried Nibs, every bit as excited as if he didn't know. Can it be? Yes. No. It is. The fair Wendy. Oh. And who are the two noble, portly figures accompanying her, now grown to man's estate? Can they be John and Michael? They are. Oh. See, dear brothers, said Wendy, pointing upwards. There is the window still standing open. Ah, now we are rewarded for our sublime faith in a mother's love. So up they flew to their mummy and daddy, and pen cannot describe the happy scene over which we draw a veil. That was the story, and they were as pleased with it as the fair narrator herself. Everything just as it should be, you see. Off we skip like the most heartless things in the world, which is what children are, but so attractive, and we have an entirely selfish time, and then, when we have need of special attention, we nobly return for it, confident that we shall be rewarded instead of smacked. So great indeed was their faith in.
Okay, I'll have to end it here. I hope you liked this. Like if you like this, dislike if you don't. Subscribe, and goodbye.